Buenas tardes. Vamos a comenzar. Esta es la novena sesión del Seminario Gobernando Urbano, como ustedes saben. Hoy nos da mucho gusto tener con nosotros al profesor Galès. Le agradecemos mucho haber aceptado venir al seminario. Simplemente, bueno, casi todos han tenido el infortunio de tomar clases conmigo, así que casi todos lo han leído y lo conocen, así que no voy a extender en presentarlo, solo les voy a recordar que Patrick Galès es profesor en Sciences Po, en París, que él encabeza la escuela Urbana en Estudios de París, y también que además de que es autor de muchas publicaciones sobre gobernanza urbana, los comparativos, sobre las evoluciones recientes del Estado, y autor de la sociología de la acción pública con otro colega. También quisiera mencionar que Patrick Galès encabeza este proyecto de comparar grandes metrópolis en el mundo, en el cual ustedes han tenido también algunos ecos. Y pues sin más preámbulo, nada más quisiera también agradecer a Francisco de Aguinaga, quien es estudiante de la Maestría de Estudios Urbanos, que ha aceptado leer los textos que nos envió aquí y hará un comentario después de la presentación. Entonces, vamos a hacer como acostumbramos, después de escuchar la presentación del ponente invitado, vamos a escuchar a Francisco de Aguinaga en esta ocasión y después vamos a intentar hacer una discusión de todos. Como les había adelantado, la sesión, además de esta, fuera de esta introducción, será en inglés. Entonces, pues, bienvenidos y gracias por estar acá.
Thank you. Buenas tardes. So it's a great pleasure to be with you tonight. I come every year now, and usually I give lectures, conceptual lectures. This time it will be more a case study. As you know, we have a long-term relation, a working relation between the Colegio and Sciences Po in urban studies. So it's a great pleasure to see our students, and I hope to encourage you to do some comparative work with us. I speak a bit too fast, all right? So tell me if it is too fast. Huh? We need to do something about it. And also, I hope you will take advantage of all this exchange we are developing with this double degree that we're starting between Sciences Po and Colegio. And I hope there will be a lot of comparative research, both at the PhD level afterwards. So this talk is very instrumental. I want to convince you that you should do more comparison between Mexico and Paris. All right? So thank you to my friends and colleagues to keep going our conversation. What I want to do tonight is contribute to our debate. And because you had Jamie Peck at some point to give you a talk, can I emphasize the fact that at the moment in urban studies, it's a booming moment. You have lots of ways to think about urban studies. I am a sociologist and a political scientist. I'm not a planner, I'm not an architect, and I'm not a geographer. I work with them all the time. But at the moment we are in a period where you have some people who want to bring urban studies with a very creative way, bringing in postmodernism, philosophy, very constructivist thinking on post-politics, on using the sociology of science and technology. And it's a very important group of scholars doing very interesting work. I am not one of them, but we discuss, we engage critically, and a lot of them, so that's one group. Another group is really post-neo-Marxist, and that's more my friend Jamie Peck. So those people, they start with Henri Lefebvre, and Henri Lefebvre. So you see the importance of France in urban studies. The first one, they use dead French philosophers. Okay? And as you know, the trendy one is Jacques Rancière. God knows why. Interesting, but not a major figure. I'm more at home with Foucault, but not so much with him. And of course, the second group is Henri Lefebvre type. And in French, we never took Henri Lefebvre too seriously, okay, for reasons one day I could explain. there's another group of scholars, and I'm part of this group, okay, where we are more sociologists and political scientists. And we try to reframe the work of Weber and Simmel and everyone's, but we try to really develop some comparative thinking. And by contrast, for instance, to US urban sociology, which is very much about race and neighborhood, and all this is very good. We are more interested to contribute to what Jenny Robinson called global urban comparative urbanism. But when we study cities, we think that things like social groups, class relations, public policy, state intervention, collective action explains and makes a lot of sense to understand the transformation of cities. So this has also implications in terms of method. We use qualitative and quantitative method. And the method part is not always the strong points of the other groups. We are less intellectually creative, but we do more comparative, systematic, comparative work. And the characteristics also of these people, some of them are economic geographers, some of them are more political science and sociology, is that the unit of analysis is always interesting. As you know, in urban studies, in the two first groups I mentioned, there's a big trend to sort of say city is dead, metropolis is dead, you only think about urbanization process. Okay? So some people will be hyper-constructivist and deconstruct every category, which is very useful, and maybe have to reinvent new categories coming from the global south. That's one way to do things. Another group will say, a lesson of Karl Marx, cities play no role whatsoever. We are interested in the urbanization process, more or less linked to capitalism or neoliberalism. We also have anthropologists, very strong nowadays, doing wonderful work and trying to recreate some comparative methods. But for people like me, we try at the same time to think in terms of globalization, of course, sometimes, but with an urbanization process that we do not oppose. We want to think at the same time at urbanization process, but also at the historical trajectories of cities and metropolis. So you always discuss the scale you work with, the city, the metropolitan areas, the urban areas. You always have to work with those different categories, and you always think that, by contrast to some of the urban studies, and my colleague geographer, I always like to mock geographers, the Americans, they like urban studies. And nowadays, urban studies is very big. So people think about the urban, and the urban. In my world, and you have a very famous paper by Cities in the World of Cities, in my world, you have cities and metropolis and urbanization process. But large firms are very important, NGOs are very important, and states have not disappeared. Okay, so my world is a world of urbanization process, cities and metropolis, in a world of cities, metropolis, states, large firms, NGOs, social class, and other categories that have not disappeared. Okay, so that's more the way I'm trying to push some of this agenda. This being said, we try not to be naive social scientists. Okay, in political science, sometimes people are a little bit positivist the hard way. Like those who study government, they say governments govern. And I always say, yes, but students study. So what? Workers work. Yeah. I don't know about you, but my students, they don't work very much on Saturday night. Very rarely. So, and they work more or less at different period of time. The same thing with government and governance. What we have is to learn the lesson of the sociology of science. What we learn from Latour and these people is that a lot of activities are not consistent over time. They are more or less intense, and they are more or less stable over time. So you have to bring in some discontinuity in understanding those government process. So that's why we're closer to sociology and the science. We try to understand in our project week what is governed and not governed. We try to understand all this more complex process of trying to organize some collective action and to see which are the power relations and to understand how things change over time. So that's more or less what we have in mind. So this paper I'm presenting tonight is part of this week project. And what I want to do tonight is I gave you two papers, but I will concentrate on the empirical paper. Is on part of this big project, and oops. Also, that is in the right way, which is easy. So, as you probably know, it's part of this big project on Mexico, Paris, London, Sao Paulo, which is a sort of 10 years project, jazz, you know, some people bring some bits and we do a bit of jazz there. The difficulty on Paris is that, surprisingly, the research being done on Paris and the Paris urban region is extremely low. For various reasons I explain one day, we are very limited, and here it comes. We don't have a huge amount. So what I've done on the Paris with my team in Paris, as we have done in every city we study, is to accumulate a number of empirical research on various elements going on the governance of Paris. So we are in this political sociology of governance. So my own interest on those issues is always to think in a sort of non-Marxist political economy, where we think about interest, private developers, large firms. Political economy means that we live in a capitalist period, very strongly so. So it will be very strange not to think about some of the large firms and some of these political economy elements. But what we know is we are in a period where those big metropolis, we see a number of resources accumulating, expertise, money, economic development, attracting of various migrants. So the big research agenda for my type of research, okay, not the agenda number 1 or 2 I mentioned, but for the people I work with, it's rather to try to think whether those large metropolis are becoming forms of political actors. Do we see forms of political regulations that take place in those cities and not at the state level or at a transnational level? In other words, to use James Scott's famous book, Seeing Like a State, does it make sense to see like a city? Okay? That's more or less a little bit of a research agenda we're trying to push forward. And to do that, of course, we need to conceptualize some of those elements, and working on that, and to do some empirical work. In my research on the governance of metropolis, we have emphasized over the years the role of utilities. Okay? Water, telecoms, energy, transport. In a number of cities I've been working in, people said they are ungovernable and it's a mess and da-da-da. Yes, but people deliver a metro. People create a water network. Of course, as I said before, it's not perfect. It has many flaws and problems. But still, things are being done. And that's the research lesson I take from philosopher Michel Foucault. Always look at the activities. What are people doing? And with which dispositive instruments. So the activities and the instruments, for me, are key elements to understand the governance of those metropolis, rather than, and of course I look at discourse, but I tend to see discourse as one element with some autonomy. In my experience, looking at the activities and the instruments is more important, and I start by that, and then I look at discourse and priorities and all that. So what is interesting in the world of utility networks is that it requires a huge amount of collective action. Building a new metro is a big mess. Okay? You need a huge amount of resources to find the money, to find the expertise, to corrupt some people sometimes. I've been told, line number 12, that's what I said. You need a huge amount of engineering, you need a huge amount of capacity to expel people. You know, these are big projects, requires a huge amount of collective action. That should not be undermined. And by the way, it is also a way to undermine the work of my excellent hyper-constructivist colleagues, telling you that all life in cities is about interactions between individuals. Well, when you look at your metro, it doesn't work so well. You can explain some other things, but you don't explain utility very well. Okay? So each method has its risk and its limitations. So I've got some risk in this strategy, but to emphasize on those elements. The second interesting element about utilities is that when you look historically at the life of cities, you always have public-public partnership in one way or another. You rarely have 100% public or private. It's always some combination of public-private, which is very useful when I see some of my excellent colleagues explaining to me that when you have a little bit of private sector in one metro, it's neoliberalism. Oh yeah, even the Romans didn't have neoliberals. Water system with private actors in all sorts of ways. Okay, so don't be dull. When you do urban research, you read history, always. Okay, and you learn from history. So private-public partnership is always the form to structure forms of utility networks. And with the long tradition of people. What is interesting also, when you look at utilities, is that it's never completely like grand design. I'm going to do a big metro, it will look like that, and 10 years later it looks like that. It never works. Okay? So you have an element of pragmatism always in those elements. Okay? It's not. So you always have some experiment in progress, and that's why it's interesting to use some of the work of Latour and the sociology of science and technology. And I'll emphasize this STS because it's probably the most important current in sociology of the last 30 years, and I would never be a Latourian, ever, like it was in my transpo, but there are lots of bits and pieces you can use to refine some of the classic frames we have used in those elements. So I will use the case of Paris, which I know better, and we are accumulating a lot of research with my students and colleagues on Paris. So what is the case? Why is it the case of interesting? The case of Paris is interesting for the following reason. In a number of public policy, as you probably know, most public policies don't work very well. Lots of them fail, lots of them do not deliver the goals they were supposed to deliver, the clienteles are not those who were chosen or the victims, so it's a hard job, public policy. And public policy in big cities is particularly difficult. And the planners have written for ages about the failing of planning in big city. Yeah, okay, so what? It's not a big deal planning anyway. It's just one public policy among many more important public policy. So, and indeed, at the urban level, you can always show that there are many failures, okay? Because big cities are complex beasts with a lot of political problems. So it's always, can always emphasize. In the case of Paris, what is interesting is that, we'll come back to the scale, but basically, Paris, when you look at the city council, and I'll show the map in a minute, had an excellent transport system for a long time. And at the level of an urban region, it was a complete failure. Okay, so you had the case of a big success for some people, rich Parisian in the center, and a very strong failure for immigrants and working class in the suburbs. Okay, so when you think about those big infrastructure, you can analyze them with the world of sociology of science and technology. You see the techniques and the dispositif and the assemblage and all these things. But you can also think about them in political sociology. For me, any public policy, who are the victims, who are the clienteles? Okay? And in this case, you have a very clear pattern over time that has been structured. So that was the case. It was well known for roads with massive traffic jams, lack of investment in railways, and I will explain the area of a big metro system, pollution, congestions, very bad service, extremely badly governed with complete divisions between the state and local authorities. That was the case for about 40 years. And then in 10 years, you have massive investment, complete transformation of a system, some success with a decrease of cars, I'll come back to that, and the making of a regional government. So in a way, my case is a case which is rare in urban studies, where you have a profound transformation of a system, and if all goes well, within 15 years, Paris might have the best transport system in the world, or one of the 2 or 3 best ones. Okay? Might. Implementation is everything, as you know. Implementation. But for the time being, it looks good. So my puzzle is how to explain this transformation. And what I have in mind is the idea that when you look at the governance of large metropolis, you can look at lots of different things. I always focus on police, because order is a key question. Of course, we look at housing, we look at different things. But of course, transport and utilities is also what makes those cities able to work. And in many ways, when you try to define what does it mean urban politics in the large metropolis, can we try to conceptualize forms of political regulations that might be particular to the big cities? The question of transport and utilities is essential. In any big city you go, you have a housing crisis, except in Mexico City, of course, as Clara knows very well. But in every big city, we have some housing problems, there are some policing problems, and there are some transport problems. So there are some issues. You go to Hong Kong, you go to Sydney, you go to Lima, you go to Los Angeles, those questions are always there. So there are some element on which to build upon the making of an urban politics, and there are cases to understand some transfer and some ideas of making. So I think the agenda of global comparative urbanism or global comparative urban studies has to do something with comparing various cities, some urbanization process, and to see how a common world of big metropolis is progressively being structured. That's what I'm trying to do with these case studies on Paris. So what happened over the last 15 years in Paris and the urban region, and I'll show the map in a second, is a huge amount of experimentation, investment, transformation, reframing, just name it, okay? So my colleagues who are transport experts, they love it, okay? One of the problems of urban studies is that some people specialize in some domain. And as you know, I'm no diplomat, so transport studies scholars, most of the time, they do a lot of work which is extraordinarily boring, empirical, with no conceptualization. So it's one of a weak field of geography, with some exception, extremely weak. Like some super housing scholars, it's better, but not always. So my point is to say, you have to understand the transport policy in relation to governance of a metropolis. If you just look at transport and transport and transport, you explain nothing. And most of the conceptual work is very weak from a point of view of social science. You may disagree, okay? My colleague in transport, they don't like me when I say that. But, sometimes, just mention. So, what do I see in this Paris, Ile-de-France? It's the name of a region. Over 15 years, a huge amount of experimentation and new initiatives. The famous Velib, so in Mexico, bike lanes everywhere, Autolib, same thing, buses in safe lane, mass investment, different kinds of planning, I will explain, new services, a new tram network, complete renovation of the suburban railways, a card, which is one card for all the transport for the whole region at a cheap price, more public space, no congestion card, some limits to use the cars in case of pollution, a huge new metro subway system, and the extension of all this innovation at a changing scale. Huge amount of things, okay? A huge amount of transformation. So you have to make sense of that. So my paper tonight is an attempt to make sense of what happened in the Paris and again, my angle is if you want to understand transport, you have to make the link between transport and governance. Here, careful. I am not a naive political scientist saying that governance is important and it explains transport. Okay? Which will be the classic positivist view of sometimes political scientists, what we do. The point is the opposite, is to argue that the governance of those large metropolis, which is sometimes complete, sometimes failing, sometimes partial, is also structured by some element in the metropolis. And my point is, in the case of a Paris urban region, the making of a transport system is one of the pillars of the making of a mode of governance of the urban region. Okay? So utility networks may contribute, in this case heavily, in the making of the urban region. Okay? That will be the argument I will make and I will try to explain. And the second thing is to contribute to the debate on public policy. Okay? I'm always interested in governance and public policy. So tonight, if you study public policy, I will not use discourse analysis, which is very important. I will mention some framing of the issues, so we need part of that. I will not be very neo-institutionalist, doesn't explain very much in this case. I will be more pragmatic in some ways. My argument is, which is done by my colleague Charlotte Alpern, I forgot to mention. Charlotte Alpern is my colleague at Sciences Po, and we work together on this paper, which is a series of papers we're doing. Is, we're trying to work on this element, but the argument is, number one, governance is about competition, okay? And we have to come back to those issues. In many ways, there's a lot of literature on governance nowadays which is about developing an hegemonic discourse, or looking at coalitions, and I've done a lot of that in European cities. This doesn't work so well. You are at the level of Mexico City, or the level of Paris urban regions, but a structural element of the politics of a large metropolis is that you have a huge amount of interest, okay? But the fact that you have a huge amount of interest does not mean that they are equal. Some interest groups are more equal than others, okay? So you have to be serious about that. You have to look at their resources. So classic old political sociology is important. The second thing is an old idea from pragmatism, which I don't often use, from John Dewey, the idea that a public policy is always an experiment, okay? Hence, the importance of implementation. I think for very big projects, which are relatively new, it's even more important. There's always an experimental element with that, which may or may not succeed. We have lots of examples of big projects that either have not delivered, like creating a new airport. Paris, not Mexico, of course. We never build a third airport. You are going to do it, we never did. But it's also, in the implementation process, a lot of transformation of those projects. And thirdly, we have learned from Lindblom a long time ago that in some policies you have a lot of incrementalism taking place. Sometimes we don't like that in science and sociology. We like to find ideas and discourse and reasons, and I always mock my colleagues who specialize in discourse analysis because they're intellectuals. So they like discourse, it's nice, argument and all, and they're right, we need that. But when I study some of these big projects, I see a lot of incrementalism, and discourse is done afterwards, okay, which is fine. It depends on what you're studying. I'm just saying that in the utility world, the discourse plays a role for framing some issues, and I will emphasize this dimension. But when I try to explain what happens at the end, it's not so important in my experience, okay? So the idea is also to try to contribute to conceptualize the implementation of policy and this experimentation. So it's an element in public policy, okay? So now I will explain the case itself, and what I have in mind is, of course, the paper I sent you with on politics in the cities, which is nourishing what I'm trying to do there. All right, I will be descriptive now, just to give you an idea, but keep in mind that my key point is governance is about competition, okay? I am tired with all these people who write about governance. You have different ways to conceptualize governance, but a lot of the work is what I call this enchanted land of governance, okay? We are nice people, we sit around the table, we found a solution, and we are all friends. It happens, okay? It happens. It is part of the governance we see in a number of cases. It happens, but not often, okay? Not often. And I think we undermine the fact that in all big cities you have a lot of fight and violence and competition between different interests. I think it is missing sometimes in the analysis. So you either have our neo post-Marxist friends explaining to us we are critical urban studies, everything is bad and it's all critical and the state is always bad, or people are very nice and they try to show us the nice governance of these different groups and how you find some nice discourse to uncover. Well, I don't think it works. Governance is also a mechanism to solve conflict. So conflict is good in many cities, okay? You need conflict. The question is, do you have conflict-solving mechanism to really govern? That's the key point. Where are the conflict-solving mechanism? That will be, for me, it's an essential part of what is a mode of governance, okay? So my point here is to show the conflict, but to show that it's not a problem if you find some conflict-solving mechanism, okay? So it's really to emphasize in public policy and governance the role of conflict-solving mechanism. That will be the key point. All right, now a descriptive part on the case in Paris, and I will go too quickly, but you have a paper, so okay, just some maps. That's Paris in 1857, when Paris is with London and Vienna becoming some of the big cities of the world. We are capital of an empire, and of course the development is done the old medieval city in the center, and then before that. That's 1907. In dark, it's Paris, the limit of Paris, And of course, classic point of urbanization taking place. And 1907 is the opening of a metro in Paris, which opens like 50 years after London, which is much more the avant-garde, not much before Buenos Aires, which is, I think, the same year as the 1964, then you have a good idea about the development of what happened in the Paris urban region. No planning and scattering all around at a bigger scale. Okay, that's about 80 kilometers from one place to the next. Number two, just the different scale we're talking about. So when you think about Paris, you must have three scales in your mind. Scale number one, the historical Paris, the one you love to see when you walk in the city. So it's about 10 kilometers on 8 kilometers. It's not very big, so you can walk a lot. And it's 2.4 million inhabitants, 2.4 million. Okay, that's the historical core. That's where all the elite live. That's okay. It used to be half working class, but now it's long-term bourgeoisement. That's the center of it. That's where the metro was developed. That's where you have a remarkable, excellent system of public transport over time. Okay. The second scale is the Paris Île-de-France. It's a region now since 1986. It's a region. You have a regional council. And that's more or less the urban areas in the large sense. It's more or less the functional urban area, okay? 12 million inhabitants. 12 million, like London, more or less, huh? More or less same scale. With some countryside in the east, and the story, classic, is you have the dense core, and the more you go, it's scattered in different sort of ways. And the third scale is what we call now the Grand Paris, okay? Which I will not develop too much today, was developed to copy London. So it's not the urban, it's the urban core of the urban region, okay? And it's more or less what is in red in the middle. And that's about 7 million. So you see my two scales, 2, 7, 12 million. And this transport question will be framed by this density. And basically, what we have seen over the last 30 years is more population in this dense core of the urban region. So that's just to show you, it's not a map of density which has been simplified. It's very clear. You have first scale, second, third scale. That's very, very simple. The Paris urban region, of course, has had some industrial developments over the years, and there were some very strong. We put the working class and the immigrants away, classic Western Europe style. You don't keep them at the center. And you create either new towns or social housing, sometimes very far away. And basically that's the map of the urban crisis in France. So you see just on the north of Paris what we call Seine-Saint-Denis, I'll come back to that later, which is the center of poverty in France, but it's also the land where most migrants arrive. Okay? So when people, public policy makers, they said, it's a pity we've done policy for 40 years and still the population is not richer in Seine-Saint-Denis. No, it's not richer, it's not the same. They arrive and then they go away. They're replaced by new immigrants. Okay? So it's a place for the mobility of lots of people. It's the old working class which has been there. And then over the years, they created big social housing, big estate, 15,000, 20,000 inhabitants. Far away, that's where you have riots and you have urban crisis. That's the map. Roads, because the planners in France are not exactly the planners historically. They are French engineers. We call them ingénieurs des ponts et chaussées. It's an old name from Louis XIV. No, it's an old thing. But they are prestigious elite engineers and they plan roads, roads, and roads. Okay, that's what they do. And they have done that for a long, long time. And you see the two main airports. And basically the trend of the Paris urban region has been over the last 30, 40 years. It was scattered development all over the region and a re-centralization of the deep urban core. And what happened was basically the urban transport system was done for Paris city and was never conceptualized for the rest. There were workers and migrants, they could wait, it's not a priority, is it? So in the French urban system, in the French political system, we give a lot of money to the regions, I come from Brittany, it's very important, or the city center of Paris. The suburb of Paris, nobody cared, and nobody cared. And you can measure the investment in school, police, or transport. That was the logic of the French system. So the government's failure at the level of the urban region. So my argument, as I said, is that the political mobilization, the conflict, have created forms of collective action. And you see that competition has led to a mode of governance. That's the, in a way, it's not completely new. If you know the literature of institutionalism, the idea that often institutions are created to solve a conflict. So it's nothing new as an idea, but I think we try to give strong evidence. So I will not bring evidence of everything. What happened? Why did we see this mega change? How can I solve my puzzle? So as often, when you want to explain a process, it's not just the process itself, it's which are the triggers for the process. And I would like to argue that what explains why change started to take place was a number of triggers that more or less took place at the same time. The first trigger is a competition with London. Okay? Paris and London have been in competition with each other for about 800 years. Okay? And in transport for about 150 years. So at the end of the day, Paris did the metro because London had a metro. Okay? And then Paris developed a regional transport system, RER, in the 60s, and London developed in the 80s the cross rail that will open next year as a copy, as an answer. So when London was doing that, then Paris said, we have to do something else. So it's a you cannot imagine the face-to-face competition and imitation between the two. Of course, a point of method, when you interview people, they never tell you that. They always say, we are the superhero decision maker, and we get great projects that we discuss with individual people. But never underestimate the importance of imitation in public policy. It's amazing the level of imitation, but you don't get that by interview. Second, we have had in France decentralization reforms, and the Île-de-France region was a late comer, but after some years they accumulate resources and got more and more autonomy from the state. And one thing emerging in the election was people wanted better transport. So the making of a different constituency led to a change of priority for the region. Okay, the politicians elected as the regional leaders, people voting for them said, we want better transport. So you have a classic with a science mechanism. Third, competition again. When you look at utilities, you have to understand some technicalities. And you have to understand at the firms. I spend my time telling urban studies young scholars, look at the firms. Because they don't like to study firms. That's bad, capitalism, we don't like that. So we just say firms are bad. They do not study them, which you do in sociology of organization, for instance. But of course, those firms, they accumulate resources. They are political entrepreneurs. So in the French system, we have two major transport public owned firms. RATP, the Metro of Paris, and SNCF, the railways. And basically, they spend their time competing to know who will build the new transport in Paris. In other words, if you take those firms seriously, you realize that they are in competition. They want to create new transport. That's their job. Running existing transport who don't work very well, it's boring, it's a lot of work. But creating new, modern, sexy transport, that's exciting. You make money, engineers are happy, they love that. So large firms are political entrepreneurs. Okay? Remember the old ideas from the 60s. Very often, you cannot say there's a problem and people look for solution. It's the other way around. Solutions looking for a problem. You must keep in your mind that in a number of public policy, a lot of firms, they develop solutions and then they try to create a problem. And it's the more you are in technology advanced domain, the more this logic is important. In my case, the RATP has lost ground and they developed the idea of a big transport system and they spend their time trying to convince everybody to adopt it. Okay? The fourth thing was the discourse and the framing of issue. The legitimacy of a big transport is very costly. So politics is about words also. It's about legitimacy. It's about discourse. That's one constitutive element of politics. So what we know in policy is that some issues become legitimate if you frame them in a proper way. Okay? For instance, if I give you the example of the airport in Paris, when those people opposing the third airport were saying it's bad, we're ecologists, we don't want a third airport, nobody listened to them. When they started to bring evidence that airport is bad for your health because of the noise and the pollution, then it's a health issue, and then it became legitimate. It's a classic issue about. My favorite is the Republicans in the US, when they try to suppress the inheritance tax. In the US, inheritance tax is a joke, okay? And because they say it's a death tax. So, you know, poor people, you tax you in your life, and then they tax you when you're dead. The death tax, it's a scandal. And they won the day. They got the vote to suppress the inheritance tax, which of course creates massive inequality. That's a different issue. So the idea was to create the transport question became a question of environment and pollution. We have to create big public transport at the level of a region because of health. For children, because of pollution. So there was a reframing of physics. So you have these three things together. The decentralization, some entrepreneurs as firms, the competition with London, and the changing frame. To present my case far too quickly, I'll just show 3 periods just to make things simple. You just keep in mind this one, the 3 levels of government. The national level, with the Ministry of Transport, where you have lots of resources and money. The regional council, so regional level of authority, government. And the local scale, which would be, in simple, the city of Paris for our understanding. Okay? So I'll divide into 2 periods, 77, 97, and 97, 2015. Okay? I will make a brief introduction to what happened before, because the inheritance is important, and then I will contrast those 2 periods. Why 1997? Well, I start in 1977 because for the first time Paris has an elected mayor, and after that we create a region. So both the city of Paris and the region of Paris have elected democratic authority, like in Mexico. It was very new, because the French state was always worried about Paris. There were so many revolutions, so they said, no autonomy for these people. You know, you always worried about the state. Until 1977, it's not new. And why 97? Because that's the time when you have both the city of Paris and the regional council becoming left-wing, and you have a different political entrepreneurs trying to push an agenda. So let me come back to that. So what you have to just keep in mind, my 3 level, Paris City Council, Ile-de-France region, French state. So I should have started there. After 1997, okay, more or less, the city of Paris, no expertise, no instruments, no money, no legitimacy. Region, same thing. Everything is concentrated within the apparatus of the state. Transport are run by the state. What do they do? Roads. Public transport for Paris, and roads for the rest. Okay? That's it. And after that, you will see all these resources, legitimacy, money, public debate shifting towards the city and the region. So the decentralization dynamics is very strong in this story. Very briefly, in the old days, De Gaulle in the 60s, of course you were not born, it was just all run by, don't need to read that, it's just all run by French technocrats, okay, engineers, and they are top down. They created this famous plan with 5 new towns and an original system of transport called RER, to modernize the old development and created La Défense, the new town, which is like Santa Fe, but created by the technocrats. So that was all run by the state, and the inheritance of that was new towns, highways everywhere, new motorways, marginalization of the suburbs controlled by the Communist Party and working class, with the Red Belt, very little investment, the new business district. So that was the inheritance, and that was the main regional transport system called RER, North-South, East-West line, okay, which became the big place for the structuring of the urban region, run part by RATP, part by SNCF. because it was mainly run by RATP and the metro system, the SNCF got not interested in the suburban trains. So SNCF, what did they do? They invest in TGV, high-speed train. All the money was put in high-speed train. Nobody cared about the trains in the suburb. That went down and down and down in quality over time. The planning was done by the state, and that's the 1994 master plan. What do you have in terms of transport? More roads, and more roads. Okay? So there's a very strong logic of the state over time. And all those years, 80s, 90s, 2000, lack of investment in public transport in a systematic way. So declining quality of train, RER is saturated, more and more people, a big transport crisis, a big classic governance failure at the level of a region. So transport is seen as low politics. It's not popular, nobody cares. It's not seen as an important question. And then progressively we see the three things I mentioned before: competition with London, Green Party, and in the corner, small-scale innovation. In the north of Paris, the working class part, still communist-led, Communist Party in France, 1% these days, it's not a big thing, but they still run some local authority. They started to react and saying, we have some money because of decentralization, we will do a tramway. So the national state saying, you cannot do that, it's not part of our plan, we don't care. The RATP is saying, we don't push tramway, we do metro, we don't care. So you have a group of local authority who decided to create a little bit of tramway in the north of Paris, which in a way is a bit ridiculous because it's not connected to the rest, okay? But it does connect some local authorities badly connected by the train or by the RER. And so what you see for the first time is a new political actors, the local authority, saying we need better transport for people in those places where you don't have it. And we can have alternative to the big firm that want to, public firm that want to create. So that was small-scale innovation on the margin. Remember, a lot of innovation starts small-scale. So the problem we have in social science is that we love small-scale innovation. We say, yeah, small-scale innovation, it's going to be wonderful. 90% of the case, it never develops. But sometimes they do, and we have to understand which ones are likely to do. I should stop in about 5 minutes. And my argument is that we have had 4 dynamics going on over 15 years. And it's the conflict between these 4 dynamics and the conflict-solving mechanism that explain how we went out of this deadlock of bad transport to all these initiatives I've been mentioning. The first dynamics is the Paris City Council. The left-wing government elected in 2001, with Delanoë and Hidalgo, and it's Paris, and they do 2 major things. So number 1, transport is important because of pollution, the Green Party part. And second, Paris is Paris, but has to work with a neighbor. It has never happened before. Okay? Paris would never work with the cities around Paris. And we should create some transport system. That will be the first dynamics over time, and we will push for a lot of innovation. We start in Paris, like Velib, and then develop everywhere else. The second dynamics is the region. The region becomes a strong local authority, they get money, and they spend their time saying, our people, it's a very bad transport system, we must have a new transport system for the region. Okay? The third one is coming from RATP. And the RATP is saying, we are in trouble, we need a new metro system, we need a new metro around Paris to link all the communes around Paris. And of course, we win the budget and we are a big company for the next 30 years and we make money and it's great. Okay? But they push for that. And the fourth one is the less expected, is the President Sarkozy elected in 2007. And Sarkozy, who had never had any interest for these other things, he was the mayor of the richest commune in France, he just says, we need Grand Paris because London is winning. Okay? London is winning, and we need to be competitive, and so we need a big transport system. So in other words, you have 4 political actors investing in transport at the same time, with these different logics I mentioned. And my story, which I cannot develop in details, is more or less the conflict between these 4 dynamics. And it will take 15 years before they finally solve the conflict, agree on a number of things, and organize a completely different transport system for the Paris region, investing dozens of billions of euros. Okay? But the point is, we have all these initiatives, these dynamics going on, actors using this transport, and then entering in conflict. So now if I had 2 more hours, I will explain all the details of the conflict, which I will of course not do. So what you must keep in mind is that everybody was in conflict with everybody. Okay? So at some points, the regions against the state, the city against the region, the city against RATP against the region. They all had conflict at different moments. So that's where incrementalism played a role. Progressively, in the conflict, they agreed on something and got rid of some other ones. And progressively, there's some compromise were made. Okay? There was no one big hero, I'm sorry. Well, Sarkozy says he's the hero. He always says that, and it's never true, so it doesn't matter very much. And they all failed in some ways with their own project. And progressively, it was political negotiation that lasted about 10, 15 years, and progressively became compromise, bringing some money, changing the system, investing, innovating, experimenting, and finding political compromise in order to deliver the good. What is not in my story is, I think, and I don't have evidence, that one of the key elements was that at some point Paris went for the Olympic Games. They failed the first time, it got to the second time. So the Olympic Games was a sort of way to say, beyond our conflict, we must get a good metro system for the Olympic Games. So it's very hard to show and to prove, but it's part of my story, and I don't know how much yet. I'm still doing research on that. Okay, I should stop on that, because it's too long, of course, the details of my competition. I'll just jump to the conclusion. Just some results. What you see is that, so my story starts in the 2000, already you have one major success, was what we call the peak car. That means that the number of transport done by car is going down. So the policy was quite effective. If you look at those figures here, this is for Paris, so the use of cars, and the use of cars, a systematic policy not to have a car in Paris, by planning, by all sorts of things. Now only 40% of the Paris City Council, the rate of car ownership is 40%. And it's going down all the time, okay? My children, your age or a bit younger, they don't even go for driving lessons. Driving a car is so passé, you just don't do it. So, people having a car are still like nasty old politique people. So, it's going down. And the level of Grand Paris is going down, and now it's going down as well. So the policy is effective in the sense that you have a very strong decline of car ownership and number of transport done by car. So the policy has success. It also feeds all the constant investment that has been done. The region has managed to develop all its ideas. Sorry, this is not so good. And the second results I want to emphasize, because I like, I do public policy, I like to measure the results, okay? And when you measure the results, you always look at budgets. Budgets. Doesn't explain everything, it's always useful, okay? And what you see is the result of this conflict-solving mechanism has been a massive agreement on spending more and more money on transport. You also have more private, but basically they created a new tax, and this is the level of public funding for public transport over time. So the revenues and the funding is going to increase for 20 years. So this is something we see. Los Angeles have made plans to increase funding for transport for the next 20 years. This is something we see in a number of big regions. And that's a big result in what I have been saying beyond the classic result. So my conclusion is to show you what we agreed is, we all had plans, jokes. Basically my story, that's a new plan. So my story is basically that they did a lot of experiments, and I conclude on that, on a new parts of the transport system, from the bus to the village to all these things. But the big chunk is this new transport system, which is about 35 billion euros. That is not organized around Paris. Okay, you see it's at a different scale. That's Paris City Council, and that's more or less the Grand Paris that I've shown you before, and the airport. So it's a different scale, where most of the investment is done here, which is the poorest part of Paris. So it's a very progressive transport system, which we have not done before in the past. So the debate has been very, very strong on those issues. It's a compromise between the plans of the four actors that agreed on this big investment. And the idea is also that because they have been in competition, because they have disagreed on everything for 10 years or 15 years, because they progressively did a lot of political agreements between the private sector, the public sector, the different level of government, in fact, transport is becoming the main matrix to organize housing, private development, environment policy, not police, I can't say that, but a number of other policies are actually organized around the governance of transport. So the conflict led to the making of a mode of governance, and the story is very simple. At some point, everybody was so upset with Sarkozy that they all agreed against the state. So the conflict-solving mechanism was everybody made an alliance against the national state. And when Sarkozy lost the election, they all agreed on the project. So it's a very French thing, all against the state. Okay? It's tous ensemble contre l'État. It worked extremely well. And that was the conflict-solving mechanism, and they agreed on that. So competition, institutionalization for model governance, that then become institutionalized and becomes the framework to organize the model governance. It took 16 years, 15 years, but that is what is going on in the Paris case. So it was a bit long. Yeah.
Thank you, Patrick, for the very, very interesting presentation. And actually, the timing is perfect for our discussion in further studies, master, PhD, other studies. It's really perfect. So, as I mentioned in the beginning of this session, we are going to listen to Francisco de Aguinaga, who is a student of Master in Urban Studies, and I again want to go to Francisco to the microphone is yours.
Good afternoon to everybody. I have to confess that I feel a little weird talking in English to all my Mexican friends and professors. So I think that is weird to you.
Spanish, I should manage if you want.
No, I prepared my... Well, I will concentrate on the other text that we read, which I think is part of the theoretical framework that is behind the case study that Patrick exposed to us. But first, I would like to begin saying that the content of the text that we read is framed in the discussion within the research project called What is Governed, which is a project that
we governed and not governed.
What is governed and not
governed. It's very important for us.
Okay. So this research project extends like an invitation to think in certain way about the city. And what is this invitation? Well, given the agglomeration of processes, agents, among other things in cities, but also given the fact that cities are spaces where exchange, circulation, mobility, and transnationalization take part, the project invites us to think about cities and their development in terms of what happens in the territory, like inside the territory of the city, but also in terms of the mobility dynamics that are being more and more globalized. So this makes us think in different scales. Then the approach developed by the team of this research project is articulated around certain dimensions. one of which is the development of a dynamic and innovative way of doing research, which seeks to extend and reset the frontiers of social science, specifically within the field of the research about cities. For doing this, the team is transverse and grouped together different disciplines and different research centers from different parts of the world. One of the central questions of this project is how to think or approach the development of cities and the urbanization process. And here is where the papers that we read enter to scene, especially the text that is titled The Political Sociology of City and Urbanization Processes, Social Movements, Inequalities, and Governance, which I think that most of us have read. I would like to highlight 5 points of this lecture, which I think are give us a very good framework to think about different problematics and processes that are happening in cities. First, cities are political beasts. Every city in history has been a political beast, and we need to think the cities as political entities and urbanization as a political process. Cities are the locus of many powers, including public and private. The city is also a place where local, regional, national, and international actors play. And cities are also places where riots, social mobilizations, inequalities take place, but at the same time, institutions, governance, policing, and social order structures the city and the development of cities. Moreover, cities are also places where technologies and physical infrastructure intervene in this development. So this implies that in order to understand the political dynamic of cities, we have to take into account the tension between those who govern and those who are governed. Second, cities are in some measure structured by governance mechanisms. Governance in the text is understood as collective action, institutions, collective actors, protest, and implementation. Studying governance implies certain questions, such as what is governed and what is not governed, how is it governed, and who is governing. So there is where we can identify many actors that participate in this process of governing the city. One important point and line of research is the role that technology and innovation is playing and transforming the game of governance. I think that this is one of the lines of research that maybe we can apply. Third, cities are historical processes. The development of cities and the urbanization processes are related to the past. Institutional and resource legacies, the built environment, social groups, historical tensions, and land ownerships influence the development of cities and the urbanization process. Fourth, when we ask questions about the limits of political regulation and of certain policies, because sometimes we ask, like, what is the role of this level of government, or what is the role of this policy in the city? When we ask these questions, it is important to look at the concrete activities and actions of different actors, but also to take into account the weight of structures, institutions, governance mechanisms, inequalities, etc. So by doing this, it is easier to measure the weight of these certain policies or political activity, not also from government, but from other actors. Fifth, we have to understand the stability or not of cities from the point of view of the day-to-day experiences and interactions of social movements, associations, gangs, etc. But also from the point of view of the rules and organizations that try to structure and create certain social order. These are the 5 points that I wanted to highlight of the lecture. And finally, I would like to thank you, Patrick, for your work and the clarity with which you express your arguments in the text and also in your discourse. And I want to ask you something. Now my classmates and I, we are, well, my master classmates, but also my friends of the doctoral degree. We are, some of us, we're in the process of choosing our thesis theme and our questions for our thesis. So what are the questions that, from the theoretical and empirical perspective that we read, can be interesting and useful for the development of science over our field of study, the city? And what about the methods and techniques that we can use to answer these questions? And that's all my comments.
Thank you, Francisco. So, Patrick, if you want to react.
Well, thank you for the comments. You have an excellent English, so it was a good idea that you practice it. It's clearer in mind for sure. Your question is a very big question. When I emphasize the different research tradition, my point is not to say some are better than others. It depends what you are interested in. And some people do great work in each research tradition is a risk and proves more or less fruitful to explain some things than others. So it's not, that's what is interesting in urban research, is that people take risk and try to explain things with different research questions, different category, different type of theory. That proves more or less fruitful. And we actually disagree between us on what it is supposed to mean. So don't misunderstand what I'm saying. I am both engaging in this debate, and I'm not shy of engaging in the debate, but I would never say these people are just doing bad work and you should never do that. No, do it, take a risk, and we'll see what happens. I'll take an example. One of the most hotted debate in urban studies is the very ambitious project started by Neil Brenner in Harvard called planetary urbanization. It's there are lots of ways to discuss with it, but my point number one, and now it's being destroyed by everybody, but my point number one, it's an ambitious, difficult social theory research project. So number one, respect, okay, because it's trying something extremely difficult at a very macro social theory. It's extremely difficult to achieve. We are trying. We'll see in 10 years' time. Okay, and I don't think it's the most promising way. I share a lot of criticism, but let's see. We'll take this risk. We'll see what happens. So we cannot. We have to. So, on what can you do? Yeah, plenty of it. Look around this table. I mean, Veronica does work in a particular type of way, and the street vendors work. It's wonderful. You learn so much with that. I see you're interested in those sort of things. That's one way to do it. Julia will do something else. Michelle will do something else. So there are all sorts of ways to do things. But the point is trying to find a research project and a research questions and method that are more or less likely to be fruitful to explain what you're doing. What I do not advise you to do, but that's my bias, some people will say otherwise. In some part of our urban studies discipline, some people think they are clever if they come with new concept. Okay? And we need new concepts. Of course, it's part of our work. But there's an obsession with developing new concept. And when it's related to crap empirical research, I am not so happy. Okay? I am very happy with new concept. Then let's see whether they are useful or not. Okay? My worry is, or some people do formidable empirical research, which are just without any research question. So my point is, you should concentrate on research design. concentrate on the research design, on the operationalization of what you're doing. So you have to think about your research questions and see which bit of theory you want to move, and think about which method you're going to use to bring some reasonable evidence with that. And you can do all sorts of things. You can do all sorts of strange comparison or not. You can do all sorts of micro emotional things. There's no problem with that. All super macro David Harvey, Hal Marxist thing. They are wonderful work. The question is, what is your research question? And I think you should really think very hard about what is your research question. And nowadays, what are the big debate you want to contribute, and what sort of things you are interested to study. And from there, always be obsessed by your research design. How I'm going to answer some of those questions, which type of method, in order to get something a bit at the end. I'm a classic social scientist. I am not in the urban studies world, which is intellectually much brighter than I am, where you try to take from dead French philosophers. It always makes me laugh. Look at French dead philosophers. In order to find new concept, and most of these people are no philosophers, so they don't understand the background in philosophy anyway, and you try to create some aesthetics of what you're doing. Why not? You do that. It's a different kind of research. It's not what I find most interesting. Very often I find the result extremely weak, but that's my bias. It's also most stimulating intellectually. So if you want to do that, why not? It's one type of thing. You have freedom to do anything you want, but they will judge you at the end on what your coherence of what you're doing, the research you've done, and what you found. So that's my only advice. You can do anything. You never some students doing micro thing on discrimination in organization for housing, and looking at interactions and face-to-face emotion when you receive clients for housing. You can do that, and that's fine if you're interested in discrimination. You can do budget analysis for this big transport thing. You can look at, it depends on what you're interested in. You can really do things, but try to find some coherence between the question you ask, the theory you use, the method that are there, and just to make sure that be precise on the added value of what you're doing. What makes me irritated sometimes is, so for me what is bad research, which is a way not to answer the question, is taking a big new framework and explaining that everything follows this framework. So in current urban research, I'm well known for being super critical of 95% of gentrification research. Because those people know nothing about social segregation research most of the time. And they are obsessed with one type of thing, gentrification, and everything goes into gentrification, which have been underlined as embourgeoisement in the past. You have different ways to think about it, and they are not precise in what they're doing. So it's one big thing, gentrification, and you have 100 people, and gentrification in Delhi, gentrification everywhere. And for me, gentrification is a serious issue. It's a serious issue. So you need to be precise on the mechanism, on the level of displacement, on the level of changing population, of whatever. And then if you're precise on those mechanisms, you're going to show the strength of gentrification. And for me, the bad research is to be ideologist and just say gentrification everywhere and go and sing. I mean, people wrote about gentrification and just completely made. Anyway, that's one example. Another good example is neoliberalism. So, there's a long tradition in urban studies of people like convergence. So they like to find big explanations so that things will go in the same way. Okay? And of course, at the level of the world, there are good reasons to do that. We see business districts over the world. There are good reasons to think about that. So when you are post-neo-Marxist, the answer is neoliberalism. Okay? And I have no problem with that. And Brenner and Peck have done very precise things to try to do what they do. I have two problems with that. The first problem is you answer any questions with neoliberalism, and you're never precise on the mechanism explaining what is going on. So you privatize a parking, neoliberalism. Empowering a neighboring group, neoliberalism. In Kyoto, neoliberalism. It's just ridiculous. The number of bad papers now. So I'm a social scientist. I want to be precise. You cannot measure everything. You have different methods, but try to be precise on what you're doing, what you're talking about. So if you want to use neoliberalism, what sort of definition you use, what can be measured, what sort of process may be there, is it a trigger, a context, or whatever. Let's be precise on what you're doing. And then, I was trained in the 80s with Mrs. Thatcher. I know about neoliberalism. I take that very seriously. That's my common point with Jamie Peck. We know Mrs. Thatcher, so we are very precise. But for me, the classic mistake, to answer your question, is, and that's a group of these people, is you say neoliberalism is everything. You're constructivist, so you have millions ways to do neoliberalism, so you are an hyper-constructivist, and then you are determinist on what explains everything. I mean, if you're a structuralist, you go with structural variables, and then you explain that the structural way. But you cannot be, I am a super constructivist from a category, and neoliberalism is everything, takes 1 million forms and explains everything. No, this is absurd, okay? So my point is, be precise, okay? Be precise. Try to identify mechanisms, variables, interpretation, narratives. You can do, look at different types of interactions, but try to be precise on what you're doing. And then what you do not explain. Because any research strategy, we are failures, and things you don't explain. So I think, for me, good research is about that. It's trying to find a good framework, ask big questions, answer a little bit of that, and try to be precise on the mechanism, on the interpretation, on the explanation, and on some of the evidence you can bring. So that's the effort that should be done. Okay? So, but people will say, I know positivist because I think lots of people have written good things before me, and they keep doing. So when I see a paper starting by, this is a new framework for new research of a new millennium, of a new global city, that's just, no, okay, no. That's just, so we are in a world, we have lots of innovation, wonderful. New concept, wonderful. Use them, precise them, qualify them. Are they theoretical concept or concept of second order? What do we do with that? So I think that's what, and in urban studies today, it's a huge mess, okay? Which is great because it's fantastically innovative. Now we need people to just construct and that's the agenda of global comparative urbanism, is trying to reframe this thing in this. As I said, there are different strategies, different ways to do good work. That's infinity. You have to do what you're interested in and then think about how to show these things. For instance, one of the best, I finished by that, one of the best PhD I supervised recently, one of my students, he was interested in squats, okay? Classic subject. Remember they did a lot of empirical work to measure that. But second, he realized that everybody working with squatters we look at squatters and they do self-management and they are against the state and da-da-da-da. And in a classic way, everybody does that. And then he thought, that's just not true, empirically. When you are in a squat, you realize that some people in the squat, very discreetly, they negotiate with the police all the time. You know at what time they can stay there or not stay there. They do some provocation, they write to the media. Yeah, there are lots of interactions that you can use. And you need to work on the public policy of dealing with squats. So it's a completely different ways and it has great results. So you should try to find classic subjects sometimes and in French we say faire un pas de côté. Try to find different angle and maybe it will lead you nowhere, but at least you try to find some things and often you see some different ways to illuminate some of the project. But the key thing is, what do you want to show? What is your research questions? What are you interested in? And from there, you read and you think and you develop your thinking. And you read beyond urban studies. A lot of the best papers you will read for cities are not done by urban scholars. But by contrast, people who work in the state, they have to read urban scholars. So you have to read beyond your small fund. I think it's enough. Thank you. Let's be too much. So
We have 2 minutes, so
I will answer quickly.
we can take 3 questions or after
The short answer.
so, Marisol.
Hi, thank you for the lecture. It was very clear, very fun. Well, I would have 2 questions about your lecture. The first one is, what do you mean when you talk about mechanisms of conflict? Because you mean like formal organization or the reactions of the actors? And in that same sense, what is the relation of this approach of looking at the mechanisms of conflicts with other ways of approaching conflict in terms of urban studies? For example, I was thinking in Patrice and the productivity, social productivity of conflict, and how is different or is similar or is related, or so that's one question. And the other one, precisely, it has to be with how is related the macro level or these global processes within these kind of studies. Because I understand clearly how it looks at implementation and the center of it, but then if we're not talking about like neoliberalization, or we are talking about neoliberalization or liberalization or this kind of process, but how? So that's my two questions.
Thank you very much. I think I have two questions also. The first one, you said that you were not a Turian. I was very interested by that. I mean, because you rely a lot on...
Try to be precise.
Because I believe that you rely a little bit on actor network theory, a little bit, and because it is a very important theory nowadays. But my question is, if you could comment a little bit more on that, on the limits of actor network theory for explaining conflicts and conflict-solving mechanisms, and a little bit of a Laturian question would be, what is the role, for example, in the case that you presented, the role of the environment in this conflict-solving mechanism choices, or on the selection of specific mechanisms? What would be, for example, the role of the pollution of the air or polluted air? Would you consider it as another actor in this conflict or not? If you could comment a little bit on that question. And the other one is, I believe that this path of conflict to conflict-solving mechanisms may be involved in a lot of contingent or contingency situations. What would be the implications of this contingency, that things may have gone another way? For comparison among cities, what would be the methodology?
Contingency question.
Yes, for thinking about the research agenda of comparing cities, how do we use comparison and contingency at the same time?
Maybe one more question or comment. Take one question. Francisco.
Yeah, okay.
No.
Okay.
You first.
Yeah, well, my question is, I mean, reading the article, you focus on governance and political arrangements between different, a vast array of actors that go all the way from parties, to transport authorities, to firms, and even universities and the EU. So, but you make a small mention about the personal transport tax. So my question is good governance enough to overcome budget constraints, or which is the role of governance regarding this issue of financing infrastructure projects, which require a large amount of money to be carried out? And especially if you could speak more about this government transport tax, which I looked and I found that is a tax that is charged to firms that have more than 11 employees. And well, I tried to imagine this in Mexico, and I think it would be very, very hard to implement here. So if you could talk about the implementation, especially the arguments of the firms not to be charged with this tax, I would thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
It's about if you are looking about a historical process in your comparative work, especially in that relation of political transfer or imitation of politics, because in my opinion it's not the same. The problem with your other kind of transnational institutions like economic bank or other kind, for instance in Metrobus politics, and I think it's different. And the last one, why working groups were out of transport politics?
Working groups?
Well, why the working groups of the working class were out of all the planning of the politic transport? I mean, I don't know if you are notice this kind of inequalities in power or resource to discuss. That's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great questions. That would require. Okay, great questions. Thank you. I'll try to answer quickly. I'll start by the end. Working class out. Not exactly, because in this organization we have all these small municipalities. From the north of Paris, they are from left, most of them, they are really representing the interests of working class groups. So we had a very strong say thanks to their political power. So in a way, the decentralization process, when it was run by the government, they could ignore most of the red belt. But with the decentralization process, the red belt has a heavy weight on the regional decisions, so could really voice the view of the working class in this transport. So the representatives were able to play a much more important role than before. Okay, the direct involvement of working class in the decision process, not in the French political system, never. Second, on the historical process, I think you're right. It's a case where you need to, just for the joke, the region of Paris 2 years ago said, we have a new innovation in transport, something completely new that will change the transport in Paris region. It's called Metrobus. We have never seen that anywhere else. Yeah, so innovations come different ways, which I find interesting. But I think I take your point that it's a different case from Metrobus. That would be what is interesting here is not to look just at Metrobus, it's to link Metrobus to everything else, to think about the structural system change over time. So that's really my quick answer. On the questions of governance, implementation, and tax, in my understanding of governance, you always have to think, how is governance operated? So the work we have done in public policy with some other colleagues is precisely to emphasize that the choice of instruments is central in structuring the governance and explaining some of the result. So in this case, it's a different paper that we have discussed that precisely. The question was, how do you make it's very expensive? How do you pay for that? Okay? And the political debate was the rest of France said, we don't want to pay to Paris again. They have a governance failure, that's their problem. Okay? So the trick was to find the instruments to govern. So when we decided we're going to do this thing, how do you do that? And some MPs, basically the negotiation was those who wanted Paris to be Grand Paris against London and to attract more people were the business interests. They were a big lobby group for that. So the idea was, okay, but you will pay for it. And they basically impose, and then of course interest groups shouted, saying, no, we don't want to pay. But the choice was done that it should be paid by firms, because the first one will benefit, that the workers will there'll be a better pool of people around, that will increase the fluidity of the labour market. So they are going to benefit much more than anybody else. So they benefit that. In the French system, the small firms are often excluded from those type of tax. So over 10, in our system, lots of them are it's the bulk of the French firms. But really, Paris is also have a huge amount of large firms. That's where the large firms are. So they pay most of the price. The large firms they pay most of the system, plus some different tax. But you're right. The choice of tax, I think, for these sort of things, is central. In another paper, we explain how the choice of tax was made. And I think it was crucial as a solving mechanism, because it was not paid by the region or by the council, by the state. Everybody paid a bit. The bulk was paid by somebody else, the firm. So it's a way to solve a conflict, to make someone else to pay. It's a classic conflict-solving mechanism. On the most difficult questions that I have, one thing. Solving mechanism and process. First of all, when you try to explain something, and I try to contribute to the explanation, okay, I'm not a pure positivist. When I've got two variables, I don't think I'm explaining too much, so sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. You can use the language of variable, but often what we find for these sort of things is trying to find the language of mechanism, so how X will lead to Y and will go to Z, and try to conceptualize those mechanisms more or less in a rational way. You have some very rational type, and analytical sociology will go very far. Some are more relaxed understanding of what is mechanism. I'm very close to the position of Charles Tilly on mechanism and processes that are at different scale. But I think trying to conceptualize micro or meso-mechanism is a very useful part of the job we're doing. Because then you can use this mechanism, understand under which conditions it is triggered or not, and think about the trigger, and then apply it in different circumstances in the field, and see the strength of this mechanism under different circumstances. So you can build a database and you can provide some quite strong explanation. It's a classic argument by Jon Elster on this mechanism. And process at a different scale. At the macro level, you're right, it's not easy, and I've not finished the work in this case. My strategy would be to be very precise on the definition, for instance, of neoliberalization, okay? Or neoliberalism. Not saying it is the definition that is the one forever. It's always a working definition. But in my case, that's what it's supposed to mean. And then you try to do that, you look at criteria, and then you try to measure or give a sense of what is relevant or not relevant. Okay? So in the case of transport, for instance, it's interesting to see that if you do a sort of database of all the big cities in the world, there's a huge increase as transport is a major issue, investment in transport, so you can make an argument about that. So for instance, in the case of Paris, some people explain what happened by the importance of two key players that explain. My argument is maybe not at the same time, but over 20 years, without those super individuals, we will have the same result in the end because of imitation mechanism, which are part of the globalization process. So again, imitation, globalization process, you formalize those processes, and then you try to explain what is going on with that. So that's the way to do it. On the Latourian question, no, I'm not Latourian. And Latour was my colleague for 10 years at Sciences Po, okay? So we discuss all the time, and I like him immensely. Okay? He is, Latour has this view of the world which is all political science and sociology is crap, and I with a new framework, you should all come with me, okay? And
he
he's a problem.
succeeded quite a lot.
A
lot of people come with him.
Yeah, mostly in geography.
Yes.
Not sociology with science. I mean, those who didn't have robust intellectual tools. This being said, I think beyond that rule, the old social science and technology is a very important current, which is a major influence, and we all need to work with that. Okay, so there's no. So with Latour, it's a pleasure. We have a debate on his last book in 1 month in Paris, and we discussed his last book. So I do not buy, I'm not a Latourian for 3 reasons. And if you're interested, we did a second book on instruments of public policy that we're going to publish in English this year. And in this book, we discuss precisely the actor network theory, why we do not follow the actor network theory. And for me, there are several reasons for that. Number one, it's a very constructivist framework. Okay, so it's a macro framework and extremely constructivist. And I think it proves formidably fruitful if you want to understand new development in science, in expertise, new types of financial markets like Michel Callot has done. I mean, it works beautifully. For me, the book of Mackenzie on financial market is a formidable book. So it works very well on a number of questions. On some other questions, for me, doesn't work so well. Still don't think that objects are actors. So from an epistemology point of view, I'm not convinced that what they have shown with that. I think it plays an important role. I take this positive very seriously. I don't think they're actors. And the actor thing, And when you look at the literature, that number one, Callot and Latour disagreed at some point on this issue, quite clearly. And some of them became very, very constructive. So Latour, when you listen to him, at some point he looks at assemblage as a key concept. And then he says, it's a bit more complicated than that. He said, I don't care, you use it when you want, I have no idea about that. So, it's not my style of doing things, I just don't. The second big difference we have is that they don't accept that there's an autonomy of politics. And they don't look at conflict, political power. This is just not part of a framework. It just does not exist. It's somewhere in the middle, somewhere it doesn't. Okay? So for me, lots of people using actor network theory in a non-rigorous way, or using assemblage in any case, is just a way to not to think seriously about institutions, or to think about, very often you know, if you have an assemblage, the logic of Latourette is right. Yeah, you mix these things together, and they can be reassembled very quickly over time, producing something else. Okay, and I think it's a powerful idea, and you can apply that. In the cities I study, it more or less never works. I see a lot of institutions. I see a lot of inequalities. I see a lot of power relations. I see a lot of interest groups. I see a lot of landowners. I see a lot of law. So it doesn't explain everything, but just pretending it doesn't exist, I think is a big, big problem. And I think it's a huge problem with the empirical work done in this line of work and a number of research. So I am not in this constructivist thinking, and it's more because of politics and because of thinking about the production of power relations and institutions, if you want, makes it, I don't think, contradictory, because this sort of framework I use is, I think, not relevant if you want to study financial markets. You don't go very far with it. Okay? But this is the problem. You know, when you look at financial markets, some people will say it's an assemblage of techniques and algorithms and da. Yeah, okay, but 5% or 75% of all transactions in the world are done by 10 banks. So I don't want to think that 10 banks don't exist. Okay, so I think it's much more complementary. So Urbano doesn't like when I say that. I say, you know, we are complementing each other all the time, in fact. And he said, no, you cannot say that. No, of course I can say that. And I use some of it all the time, and I still think it's a major. It's a completely different epistemology. So you take different risks and you explain different things. Okay? But still, you have to be rigorous empirically. And I think in the French context, people like Muneza and Calon have been doing excellent work in doing that. Their way to explain big policy has been far less convincing. But more in the medical science and when you use expertise and all that, then it's extremely fruitful. Or the environment, I mean, they've done some wonderful work. So it depends how you use it. But I'm not, you know, I like to look at power relations. I think in my world, often it plays a role. And finally, on the role for environment, air pollution, in this case, I can see very well your question. It could have been the case. We could have seen air pollution as an argument enrolling all the actors and being explaining what happened. It didn't work that way, which is an hypothesis we checked out. It was more generally speaking, it was more a framing of the argument to legitimize and to help a solving mechanism rather than the explanation for what happened. But it could be the case. One of my colleagues done a work on the new transport system in Grenoble, and he shows very clearly that identifying a clear argument in terms of air pollution was a decisive step that made people agree on a new transport system is needed and you need to do so on. So sometimes that is the case. In that case, it was not the case. It was more a framing issue to help people, you know, legitimizing a little bit what was going on, but legitimizing a little bit, not as the argument as a main mechanism to explain what was going on. But it could have been the case. So I take this hypothesis very seriously, and I know cases where it was the case. That was not the case in the case of Galès. It could have been. So it remains always an interesting hypothesis to try to move it. So conflict is not taken seriously in the Latourian framework. I didn't answer very well your question because the point is to identify mechanism, but my point is what is interesting is to look at conflict solving mechanism, which is a particular type of mechanism to solve a conflict. And I think those ones are a crucial one in those sort of situations with lots of actors. And that's structural governance, because when you have a good conflict solving mechanism, then you can encourage debate, you can enroll actors, you can create some controversy, you can bring different type of expertise, and the richness of the debate and the quality of what you can achieve is far superior. So that's also an idea that you can find in Calon and that's been work on. So I think being precise on those mechanisms that have not yet completely identified this word, is a very important way, because then other people can use your mechanism and see where it works in different contexts. And that's where I resist a little bit going too far in the constructivist road, because then everything explains everything and changes over time and you go nowhere. But of course you have to be constructivist. Your category have to be defined and change over time, and you have to think about that. And I finished the contingency issue. Contingency is that context. When you say that, you say nothing. Bring evidence. Okay? I see a lot of contexts of contingency that are not contingent. Okay? But are in fact far more stable or explained by other things. So when you say contingency or context, yes, but be precise. Show us what is really contingent and what is in fact, and I'm not, my way of thinking is probabilist, okay? So a lot of things are likely to take place in certain conditions. So I don't like the idea of contingency in a systematic way. I want it to be demonstrated. Most of the time, there are some elements are likely to take place and are likely to be explained by this thing. And then, the same thing, some mechanisms are contingent. Maybe not. Maybe there are some triggers under some consistencies, with some triggers, they are taking place quite often. So I think contingency often is a bit laziness. Sometimes we need to go a bit further. This being said, I think it's very important to show the contingencies when you have it. So my point is, beyond it's contingent, it's context, or it's all explained by this and this, it's a whole grey area of partly constructivist and partly trying to find mechanisms under which consistencies they play. They are not complete, they are not linear, they are disconsistencies all the time. That's what I try to frame in this thing.
So, 10 minutes, so somebody want to ask a question or? No?
Yeah, sorry.
Julian.
Thank you very much, Patrick.
We are very old friends, actually. Expect some tough questions, believe me.
No, I always like reading your work because you remind us, or you remind me at least personally, of the weight of structures and institutions and conflict and power relations. And I think this is absolutely crucial. And I follow you on, for instance, the story you're telling us about the making of the Grand Paris and your puzzle, right? Why is it that what triggered this massive change in the past decade in the transport system? My question is, in your story, there's only the public script, in the sense that when you talk about these actors kind of produce collective action, and I'm trying to understand how does this collective action, how does this decision to invest happens at a certain period of time, and how was the conflict resolved? I am with you completely on this, that this produces collective action. It has a collective effect on the city. And everyone in there has their interest, and it's negotiated and everything. But there's also a lot of things behind. These actors are not just public. Who went for a beer with whom? Who slept with whom? What, all of this also explains the resolution of the conflict. And I'm saying this because in a place like Paris, it makes a lot of sense to focus on the public script. I'm not sure it makes that much sense in a place like Mexico, where all of the private relations are as important, if not more, than the actual public script of the conflict resolution mechanisms that you're describing. So my question is that balance between private or invisible conflict resolution and visible public conflict resolution, that balance changes from one context to the other depending on the institutional system, the political culture, etc. So when we're thinking about comparative urbanism, that balance between public and private script, or the hidden script, I'm using James Scott, like you cited, needs to be taken into account, but it's present everywhere, not only in places like Mexico.
No, you're completely right, completely right. I usually deal with that with a different language which means the same thing. I like to try to say in different cities the extent to which we can show the institutionalization of the political realm, which is more or less done. And that's also the logic of what is governed and not governed, is precisely to try to show what you would say the public and the private element into that. And so that's completely part of our thinking. And I completely agree with what you say about Mexico and Paris, and I think it should be an essential dimension on the complaint, also because what is the public sphere and institutions are very different meanings from different contexts. So you're completely right. In our analysis, of course, we look much at the level of organizations and sometimes at the level of individuals. And we stay, to a large extent, even when we look at private interactions, we look at public figures which may have political rivalries, for instance. For instance, the classic joke in this story is that the president of a region was a particular type of socialist from Michel Rocard, and so Sarkozy appointed as a minister to negotiate a guy coming exactly from the same group, and they were the same sub group of Socialist Party for 40 years, but they hated each other for 40 years, so it was even worse, like it was before. So we have a little bit of that going on. On the sleeping side, it's very important for the Green Party. You cannot understand the Green Party in France if you don't understand that. It's just incredible. So there are some elements, but the point is, to what extent it contributes to explanation, to interpretation, or whether it goes into the really explanation of what is going on. And again, I'm very sensitive to the time element. Something takes place at one given moment, often with some contingency. But when you look over 20 years, the dynamics is there, and it's going to take place a different way in some ways or another. Okay, so it and when you are able to reconstruct from the micro to the meso macro, it's very, very useful. In that sort of case study, you have huge money, big institutions, big interest groups, big firms. So I would say that the private dimension is not that important. Although at the level of, but when I interviewed, at some point, the minister was appointed, who was well known, he's a former Communist Party guy, became right wing, is intellectually incredibly mediocre, but he's very good at something. He eats with people all the time. So his strategy was, I have no interest. These people want to get a deal, but they don't negotiate very well. So he basically invited them every week to his ministry, and they were not allowed to leave before 4 o'clock in the morning, completely drunk each time. And his strategy was getting them fed and drunk every week. At the end, they agree on something. And it was a negotiating strategy, and at some point it worked in some way. So I think it's something in this research so far, we have not done that in a systematic way. I think it works to explain the negotiating strategy, and maybe we could go as far as saying it's maybe a mechanism to get some agreements at some point. So I think I would agree with that. But I would resist saying this is what was central in explaining the evolution of the structure. So I think what is important is to take those things into account and to understand where it contributes in your explanation. And sometimes it could be central, it could be a real trigger to allow this other mechanism to take place. So that could be, but clearly, the choice of this guy, well known for doing these things, was part of the strategy to solve the conflict. So it was a clearly political act. And the job of the guy was, they all hate each other. There's 4 groups I mentioned, they're all in conflict, and I'm going to get them to negotiate something. I will bring some money, and I will. And it was extremely effective. So I think some of this private element can be also, so I think you're right, number one, to say you should always ask this question. To always think about this level of private, public, formal, informal, is always a question. Then we know it's likely to be more fruitful in some context. Okay? If you think about the politics of culture in France, in Paris, it's like Mexico. It's lots of connections there. You need to understand each other and something. So it depends of if you are in a public policy domain which is heavily institutionalized or not, if you have massive economic interest or not. So I think you can do something about that. And then private and public interest means different things, as we know. If we were in Karachi in Pakistan, very well public and private mean very different things with a religion, for instance. So these questions have to be asked, and I think you're absolutely right, and I take your point fully, completely, I agree completely with you. And that should be asked systematically, which we may not do systematically.
Jaime.
I have 2 questions. The first one is a question about this comparative study, this week project. Have you identified that the social protest as one of the modes of conflict. If social protests tend to systematically have a particular outcome with projects like transformation of systems of transportation or utility networks. I mean, is social protest systematically having a specific outcome in the governance of cities? And the second question is specifically about this case of Paris and its transformation of the transport system. Has the issue been framed as a question of social to diminish the social inequality? If this transformation you told us it's placed as a question of environment and health, but did social equality ever made it into the discussion? These are those questions.
Yeah. So, Patrick, if I understood the transport system change in Paris, the key element is the huge project you talked about. And is this working as a key element to regional organization of governance? And it's true, if you think it's right, I said, yeah, is something specific to Paris case, or we can find something similar in another French or even in European cities? I mean, the key role of transport system change to organize several actors in a huge region is something we can see further than in the France region.
Maybe Mexico, but I'm not sure about the others. On the first question, social protest. It depends. The first thing is, I think the question of social protest should be always asked and never taken. In urban research, we love social protest. Okay? Most of us started urban research because we think that there should be some social protest about something. So there's a risk in urban research of always over-assessing social protest. Okay? And there's a risk to emphasize the role behind explanation, the role to explain the mobilization, to explain the change, or to say nothing can take place if you don't have social protest. So I'm not saying it's not important. I'm just saying that in urban research there is a very strong super point, and that's have to be measured and seen empirically. Also because when urban research became big in the 70s, it was very much linked to the Marxist groups, and it was a time of massive urban protest. So there were good reasons to take that very seriously, because it was a time when it had massive impact. I'm just saying it depends. Okay? There are some cycles, some periods where social protests do not play such a big role or play a limited role. So we have to study them. And I am very critical, if you want, of some of the research on Latin American cities, explaining that nothing takes place if you don't have social protest. Mayors play no role, government play no role, public policy play no role. Second, people who do not understand how social protest change public policy, and you have various mechanisms. It's a literature which is well known, and often they participate to some of this change, sometimes they don't. It's just. And thirdly, you have the other literature which explains that social protest is everything. If you don't use social protest, nothing. Cities without citizens, that sort of argument. I just don't buy that at all. This being said, of course, both social movements and social protests have different forms and can play a very important role. And we have to study that. You may have massive mobilization and very little effect in public policy. You may have small social protests with big effect. So all this has to be analyzed, researched, and demonstrated. In this case, social protest played, the role of social protest is minimal. Okay? There are some groups complaining about transport for a long, long time, but they were never a big pressure group over time. Okay? There's one exception to that. Basically, the Green Party played the role of shaping this protest and voicing those questions. So it is not explained by social protest. The only exception to that is within Paris, because the Green Movement basically mobilized a number of groups and tried to encourage social protest in order to push for more transport. And the paradox is that they managed to do that in Paris where the problem was minimal, and they completely failed to do that in the rest of the urban region where the problem was big. Okay? So in general, you have to take that seriously, to study it and to understand that. That's part of urban life, and in some contexts it's very important, but in this case it was not. It was not. But my friend Eduardo Marques in São Paulo always tells me, all these people explaining transformation in cities in Brazil with social protest, they understand nothing about urban policy and social policy. So it has to be examined and studied empirically, okay, to be sure. On your second question, yes, the question of social inequalities was very strongly put forward on the agenda. Why? Because among my 4 types of actors that I mentioned before, the cities of Paris, that was not a big issue. The Sarkozy government competing with London didn't care. But at the regional level, for the left-wing government, it was an alliance between the Greens, the Communist Party, and the Socialists. So they were elected from the Red Belt. So for them, the transport question was first and foremost a social inequality question. Okay? So they really pushed extremely hard in this direction in the negotiation, when the project of Sarkozy was to put more transport for airport and business district, and ignore completely the poorest neighborhood and the east of Paris. And the city council of Paris didn't care very much either. So that question of social inequality was very much pushed also by the regional council. So in the final agreement, it was not too difficult to find, because in a way, the government wanted more transport from the west of Paris and the airport and the business district, and the region wanted more transport from the east of Paris and the north of Paris for the working class district. At the end of the day, we agreed on combining the two and spent 3 times more money. That was more or less what happened. But this question has been very strongly. You really have the 3 views of the world: the Greens and the Paris pushing for environment and air pollution, the right wing pushing for competition with Paris, business district, transport, airport, Olympic Games, and the more left wing pushing for social inequality issues. And those 3 completely, and it was not just the 3 discourses, but also 3 interest groups and 3 parties in some ways, combining each other. So that was very strong. And the legitimacy of a project comes also from that, from this social inequality question. Because again, those who would benefit more are the north and east belt of Paris. That was in bad shape. So that's a big issue. However, you have a second question behind it, which is what happens next. I've done last year with my students an online course at the Grand Paris, so I just do a bit of publicity. It just came out in English this morning, so you can find that on the internet. À la recherche du Grand Paris, searching for the Grand Paris. And we did a lot of interviews of inhabitants. Okay, so it's an online course with some experts and some inhabitants. And the inhabitants are very clear. They say, yes, we want more transport. We are very happy with this project. But will we still be there in 10 years or 20 years' time? If they use that to create other gentrification of embourgeoisement, and we have to go further east, then we will be the losers. So the transport only makes sense if we still have housing for people like us. And I think it's a key issue. So the risk for the left is to argue for this transport, but the effect might be displacements of population. So that has to be think and considered politically very precisely in governance terms. And that's why it is important. And that's why, and I finish on your question, in a way, the grand project of the huge investment is always a feasible one, but as I tried to explain at the beginning too quickly, it was linked to all sorts of other things, the new tramway system, the new car, the parking space. So what is really structuring the governance of the region is not just the train system, the metro, it's much more everything around it. And around these questions of Velib and this question of bicycle lanes and buses and everything, everybody's now asking the questions of housing and urban renovations and urban planning and where you could renew schools. So it's a discussion around transport, basically structured a discussion about the urban transformation of the areas. And people who have used to negotiate about transport are now negotiating around some other issues. And now you see some ways of negotiating, which are called institutionalization, which are now becoming stabilized and which provides the structure of the governance of the region. But it's not just the transport itself of the train, it's more everything around that went with it, from the role of the car, to the bikes, to the and that's where it's been changed scale to the Grand Paris scale and has become central in all those issues. And so the transport has helped changing the scale of governance of Paris from 1 to 3 to something more integrated. And that's what the transport system has sort of unlocked in some ways. Is it true for everywhere else? I would not say that. Number one, because the governance failure was not so central in a number of big cities. So Paris was not good on that particularly. And in London, for instance, the railways the governance is far more fragmented with very strong privatization. So those firms have to make money before anything else. So they cannot negotiate on some other issues, as we've seen here in many ways. I would say Stockholm played a very similar role. So I could think about some examples, but it's not systematic. Yeah, Netherlands, yes. But not at all in Milan, for instance. Not so much in Madrid, although Madrid is an interesting case, but not so much. It failed to do that in some ways. So sometimes it played this role. I would say it's more systematic that it plays a role along this direction, but so it's more likely, and we see more of that in a number of cities. Los Angeles would be a good example as well, but not in a systematic way.
Okay. Well, thank you, Patrick, and thank you, Francisco. I want to announce two things. Next Friday we are going to present a book. You are invited. And next Tuesday we have an ordinary class of local government and the Master of Urban Studies. But for this session, we will organize an open class. So if our students of PhD wants to come, welcome. And finally, well, we are going to send you an email to the next session of our Gobernando Urbano seminar. I suppose that will take place in September, maybe next semester. Thank you, and we are going to give you kind of attestation for participation in the seminar. Yeah.
Just.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.